All right, John Stegeman, aka Steggy. We all have awesome nicknames. I love that one. So, for the audience, John is an applied technologist at neo4j, and I know you all know who that is. One of the pioneers in the space, if not the leading player in graph database, aka knowledge graph, all the stuff that I love and geek out about. So, John and I have connected over a bunch of things digitally, and here we are talking, including that I think it was the Graph RAG manifesto your CTO wrote, which was so awesome. So without further delay, John, do your thing and do the intro off the top here, so I don't steal any thunder and misrepresent anything. So please go ahead.
No worries. Thanks, Alex. Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to talk to you. As you said, I'm an applied technologist. My whole career, I'm older than I look. I'd say I've been doing this for 30 plus years. And from day one, I've all been, I'm a nerd, right? And a nerd is really just a geek who's become self-aware. I love playing with technology, and I love solving problems with technology. So I joined Neo4j a couple of years ago, and kind of doing the knowledge graph RAG thing right now, which is super hot in the market. So excited to chat and see where this goes.
I love it. All right, so we're going to jump right into that question that you and I were ping-ponging back and forth and getting excited about, right? So generally speaking, I've never talked to anyone in our world where when I start talking about graph database and I start geeking out on the implications of knowledge graph, et cetera, they start just going, the eyes get big and they get excited and they get dialed in. And so for the audience, and I hope that all 12,000 plus of you are listening to this, John, I want to give you a chance to can you in your awesome, storytelling way, can you explain the answer to what is a graph database just generally? And kind of what is a knowledge graph generally, and maybe do whatever you want to do behind it. But because every person I've talked to, the eyes get big when the light bulb starts to go on, and I want to give you the chance because you did it for me. So please.
Yeah. Thanks, Ali. So what is a graph database? And I heard a great analogy yesterday when I was talking to somebody, and they said, "Is this accurate?" So kind of the way we think about data in companies particularly, we think about them as almost like a spreadsheet, right? So when we capture data, we very intuitively think rows and columns.
Yep.
And so that's like a pretty common database type that we call relational.
Yep.
If you think about it, though, we lose a lot of context there. So if you think of, instead of a spreadsheet analogy, think almost like Google Maps. Right, so Google Maps, you could see things, you could see how they're connected, you could see the paths that go between them, you can probably figure out the cost for navigating that path maybe, or how long it might take you. So what a graph database is just another way of thinking about data, where instead of chopping things up into rows and columns and square boxes, we think about them in terms of how they relate to each other. So for you and I, if we think of a digital representation of ourselves, we have a relationship, right? Because we met on a certain date, we talked about these topics, we share some common interests, maybe we shop at the same store. Graph databases are just a way of capturing those relationships and using those to give insight into the data. And so what is a knowledge graph? A knowledge graph is really just taking data that you have and representing it in that way and organizing it in a way that adds some kind of a value for a business. How you organize it depends on your business, of course. Yeah, it seems like you have a comment or question.
I've never heard, and again, I'm not saying this because we're being recorded, I want to lionize you. I have not heard you say it that way, and I love that, because if I look at a Google map, I was driving my mom down, she moved down to Silicon Raleigh, big shout out to all things North Carolina, but we moved her down, and we were driving, and I was like, "Mom, I'm driving." So, and good son, right? You can't look at your phone while you're driving. That's terrible. Never do that. Yeah. It's like worse than drinking and driving times 10. But I was like, "Why don't you just open up Google Maps and kind of figure out where we might want to go eat?" So what you just did for me is you illustrated that if I put point A and point B effectively in a traditional spreadsheet, I don't get any context between what's on the road between A and B. And instead, using Google Maps, we saw Kava. She loved it. It was her first time, and she's sold, right? So shout out Ron Shake, who has built an amazing business. But I think that's an awesome way to describe it because it's very visual and it's very easy for all of us to understand. So let's go one step further. One of the things you and I spoke about, and I always ask the question, right, is when the light bulb starts to go on at an enterprise business, right?
Yep.
Whether that's a light bulb that goes on because there's a technology group that totally gets it and they're dialed in, or something else. Can you walk us through how that process kind of works generally in terms of when and where and how the technology group might understand it versus others and how that happens, generally?
Yeah, I mean, generally, most of, at least here at neo4j, right, I'll speak from that perspective, most of the time that light bulb goes off kind of from the bottom up of an organization. So a developer, an architect, somebody who's building something says, hey, I've got this problem, and my problem is I'm trying to see how all my data relates to each other. And so let me just use an example. They say we're trying to detect fraud, right? So if I send you money on Venmo, just that transaction in and of itself, there's not enough context to identify that it's fraud. If I'm not a fraudster, you're not a fraudster, it looks legit. But if all the way back around here, you've got a connection to some account that's used by a money launderer, or I've transferred some money to somebody else who's then doing some kind of thing. So it's the connections to the other pieces of data that add the value. So somebody says, I'm having a hard time doing this in a spreadsheet, or a hard time doing this in square rows and columns. So that's when the light goes on that I need a better way to do this. And so it's usually not a top-down type of a thing where an executive says, oh, graph databases, you need to go find a problem for this. It's somebody from the bottom up who says, I can't do this in the way I'm used to doing things. So what other kind of tools do I have? And you and I talked the other day, Alec, when I'm not a bigot when it comes to technology. Relational databases, hey, they're great for the things that they do, and they're there to solve a problem. And so are document databases and all the other kind of databases we use. They're good for certain things. And oftentimes the light goes on when somebody says, this is a graphy problem.
There you go.
In other words, there's some information in the connections or the relationships that I'm not getting any other way. And so that's when the light bulb goes on and says, you know what, this is maybe a tool that I need to look at as a way to help me solve my problem.
I love that. I think for all you business people that are listening, in my network, and I know there's a lot of them, I think one of the things that really, John's touching on is a graphy problem. And John, you keep me honest on this, but a graphy problem tends to be a problem where data sets are pretty well connected, whether you realize it or not, right? So if there's commonalities, so if there's 1,000 different businesses that are clients of a business, and perhaps some of those businesses do and don't take advantage of all the various services that said large business, multinational, that's when you're starting to step into these graphy territories. Is that about right, John?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of thinking about it. And it occurred to me as you were saying that I want to say one thing that a graph is not, because when you hear graph, I think a lot of people think about, okay, those line charts and pie charts and things. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, I guess, the mathematical concept of a graph that was invented or discovered or codified, a long time ago in the 1700s or something.
Yeah.
But it's about how things connect to each other, and before I learned really what graphs were about, I didn't really realize how much that graphs are really everywhere. If we think about businesses today, we're getting more and more interconnected. The world is getting more and more interconnected. With the internet and all kinds of technology we have that connects us. And what is data? Data is just a representation of the world, right? So as the world gets more connected, our data is getting more and more connected. And that just leads us more naturally to say, you know what, this sounds like what I always call a graphy problem, because the value is in the connections just as much as it is in the data.
To that point, John, and so I'm a very visual learner. Like I am, I don't know, like, the difference, it's night and day for me. And therefore the reason I gravitate to this stuff is I love the whiteboard, right? So if you jump on a whiteboard, what do? You draw circles and lines and circles and lines. And for those that are, if any of this is interesting, you start looking at this stuff and you realize that exactly what John's saying is it's whiteboard appropriate, right? It's like taking a like the way we talk and the way we communicate ideas and things on a whiteboard, it goes back and forth. And I think that, to your point, I'm glad you clarified that, because again, I have found when I talk to people about graph database and so on and so forth, knowledge graph, they jump all over that. Now let's just, in the interest of time, because again, I told you, I warned you, I will talk too much. I want to give you a chance to just jump into some of the stuff we talked about, where we're stepping into phase 2 of the generative AI era of business, right? We're all realizing, hey, you got to put pieces together, compound AI systems, yada, yada, yada. And boy, is this an exciting opportunity to introduce the relationship between a knowledge graph, graph database, the outputs, et cetera, and LLMs and generative AI. So please, jump on in on that one if you could, John.
Yeah. And so you mentioned kind of the buzzword that everybody's talking about, graph rag. So what is graph rag? Graph rag is basically where we take an LLM and we let it get knowledge from a knowledge graph. We let it get information. So, what is a knowledge graph? A knowledge graph is just a bunch of interconnected information that we've organized in a way that we can get some context out of it. And, I know I shared a story, and I think this would be a good time to kind of talk about it, is, we think about knowledge graphs from a business perspective, but I can share a personal experience with the knowledge graph that I thought was really interesting. So we've all used these AI meeting, assistants, right? They transcribe the thing for us and then they summarize it for us. I was experimenting with a wearable device that does the same thing in the real world. And so I took that device with me when I took my granddaughter to the hospital. She had to get a cast off. She had a broken arm. And, talked to the receptionist. I'd never been there before. Receptionist, the x-ray technician, the person who took the cast off, the doctor, all these people. But meanwhile, I'm capturing all this kind of a conversation. And when I got back, I had a nice transcript, which is something I could read, but then I took that transcript and dropped it into something that created a knowledge graph out of it. So I took all that conversation and I identified, okay, who are the people in the conversation? There's me, there's my granddaughter, there's my daughter who is with me, there's these people, what kind of interactions we have, what kind of relationships were formed there. And then I was able to start asking questions that I was getting more insightful answers than just taking the transcript and dropping it into ChatGPT or Claude and saying, hey, tell me some things about this. I was able to now start to see, connections in my son, who wasn't even there, but was talked about because we were on a speakerphone with him or something like that. I was able to get so much more context and understanding out of that by looking at it in that way, kind of breaking it down and into its individual elements and then understanding how they relate to each other.
I love that story. And I think the other one you shared, which unfortunately we have to cut it short. We're going to do this again because we could go on, but that one about the conferences, right, where we all go and have 50 conversations, it's so difficult to take notes and so on and so forth. I think bringing all this stuff in the real world is when it really starts to get real. So by all means, John, I couldn't thank you enough. I think my network and audience is going to love this, and we'll have to do it again. So thank you very much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Alec. I had a super fun time.
Cool. See ya.